Thanks everyone. I'm going to talk today about partnerships, but I'm also going to do a bit of scene setting as well around why we're doing something like the Translational Research Grant Scheme. And then, of course, Don will in much more detail go into the model, and then that will follow by Michelle Credacross, who'll give you those really nitty-gritty practical tips in terms of what you should be doing with your applications. So, what the role of research in healthcare? Well, we know that health research has high value to society and that it can provide important information around things like disease risks and trends, the effectiveness of interventions in clinical settings, but also public health settings, patterns of care, but also, importantly, around healthcare costs and efficiency. And there are lots of conceptualisations out there of what the role of research is and its impact on policy and practice, and this is an earlier iteration of the model that Don is presenting. It is different, but it's one amongst many that are out there. Many of you would be familiar with the translation models that talk about bench to bedside, T1, T2, T3, T0. There are many variants of this model, but I think this is a useful one to get us to think about the different typologies of research that are out there, and when we are thinking about applying research evidence to policy and practice, what those different types are. So the first type is problem definition, and it's things that are focused on epidemiology, demography, and they're essentially telling us things, what is the shape and size and the nature of the problems that we face. The next sort of step is solution generation, and it's really where we begin to think about how these problems might be solved, things like pre-testing, literature searching. And the next grouping from 3 to 5 is what we call intervention research, and this is a particularly important type of research, and it's no accident that this is one of the key focuses of the Translational Research Grants Scheme. And it looks at things like, was a solution effective? Your randomised controlled trials, was this efficacious? Can we take those efficacious interventions and then replicate them in different populations, different settings? And then the third type of dissemination is can these solutions be disseminated more broadly across health systems? And then we sort of move out of a research frame into more of a monitoring frame, and we look at asking this fundamental question, can these things be sustained? So obviously the Translational Research Grant Scheme wants us to sort of focus in this area. I think the quality of the evidence, I think where Michelle will make this point, we are after the best quality evidence. But certainly we need to answer questions if we are ever to have the greatest impact on the health system in the space of dissemination, where we are beginning to replicate things and trying to implement strategies at scale across health systems, because that's really where the rubber hits the road for healthcare. Otherwise, we do deny our client groups, our patient groups, the best and most effective interventions. So, the importance of getting better value. Well, we know that biomedical research has been estimated to consume almost $1 trillion globally, and the 2014 Lancet edition on research waste suggests that there is about 85% of that investment is wasted. Now, I think there's a lot of debate around how some of these figures were arrived at, but nonetheless, when you're looking at $200 billion annually is being wasted, and some academics have pulled together some estimates of this, and these estimates came about by saying that simply if you look at the number of clinical trials that are conducted, of those clinical trials that are registered, only 50% are completed. Of those clinical trials that are completed, only about 50% are published or released to the world to use. And of that sort of the trials that are published, a large proportion of those are really focusing on questions that may not be of the greatest policy relevance. There may not be sufficient information in those trials to really replicate them. So they're suggesting that there is a lot of research waste. So even if we halve that figure, there is still a lot of work that we can do as a sector, but also as a health system to get better value care. We have initiatives like Reward now. The Lancet have set up something to really push this agenda to reduce waste in the system. We also have an important thing around intervention research, and I'll explain why intervention research is so important. We talked about that in the model and those 3 different types of intervention research, but the reality is that in the peer-reviewed literature, and there are a number of studies that have been conducted in Australia and overseas looking at the literature, it's clear that the majority of research that's published in the peer-reviewed literature is descriptive in nature, and that only about 1 in 5 studies that you will read in medical journals or public health journals actually is focused on interventions. And then when you begin to think about those intervention studies and you look to try to sort of put them across those typologies of efficacy, replication and dissemination, we see that the vast majority of studies are efficacy studies. Now, there's nothing implicitly wrong with that, but there are far fewer in the space of replication. So once we are focusing on the science of discovery over the science of implementation. And when you look at the dissemination studies that are published in literature, there's only about 2 to 5% of intervention research studies that are published in literature are actually dissemination studies. And that's really where those changes to the health system can be applied in that dissemination phase. But as I said, I don't want to give the impression that the Translational Research Grant Scheme is just about focusing on dissemination research. I think we have to move as a whole sector in that space, and it's just an observation and some evidence to support that claim. In terms of reducing research waste, the Lancet and sort of other authors have suggested there are things that we should be doing. They include things like setting research priorities and research questions that take in account the needs of end users. It's really working with policymakers, clinicians, health service planners. Obviously conducting research in collaboration with those end users. Establishing implementation laboratories, and I'll explain this concept a little bit. It'll be familiar to many of you. I think the veterans, the vet in the United States set up the notion of a laboratory where they worked with healthcare delivery, integrate researchers into practice, and then feed that information back into how health services are delivered. And I think in many ways the Translational Research Grant Scheme is really looking at LHDs as a laboratory. We're trying to get everyone to collaborate, researchers, clinicians, to then improve healthcare in an ongoing way. And the TRIG scheme is providing funds to enable us to have a laboratory in that space. So why are research partnerships important themselves? Well, they can reduce the time from evidence generation to practice implementation. I think there's a lot of intuitive logic here around engaging policymakers and clinicians and people on the ground with research projects does reduce that period of time where these research findings are applied, as opposed to doing stuff independently of those decision makers. The focus on the research questions that are more likely to impact on patient or population health outcomes. There are enhanced understanding of the application of research findings, obviously because we're engaging end users in that process. And that also enhances research capability and capacity within health systems. And this is an important point because by virtue of getting LHD staff involved in these projects, policymakers, people like myself, I got involved in research projects. I worked in policy making and then got a passion for it, did a PhD, built capability, and that's how that broader sector capability is built, by getting people involved in these research projects that may not otherwise get involved. And also we enable partners to leverage additional funding. Now this is an important concept as well, because once again in New South Wales we've been very successful in the space of health services and population health research in actually leveraging this. It's one of our strengths, and if you look at the NHMRC funding for biomedical research, we are actually far behind Victoria, but when it comes to health services and population health research, we're the leaders in the nation. And we've been able quite successfully in New South Wales to leverage a number of large NHMRC partnership centres that are located here, one on prevention and one on health system sustainability. And that's brought $20, $30 million of funding to New South Wales, a greater focus on activities. Those centres are national, but they are located here in New South Wales, and a lot of those benefits are derived. So the TRIG scheme is a really great opportunity for us to leverage more off the activities that we're doing. So when we think of partnerships, there are lots of different types. We have a more sort of responsive audience, and I've sort of described myself as a responsive audience. Sometimes I'm approached by a researcher saying they've got a great idea and that the NHMRC partnership grants are due in 2 weeks' time, and would I be interested in being an investigator and an associate investigator? And in that context, or it could be the same with a clinician, I'm a responsive audience, I'm listening. My engagement is quite passive. But, these things are often investigator-driven, and there's nothing wrong with investigator-driven research, but different partnerships are appropriate for different things. So on the other end of the spectrum, we have what we call a co-production model, and that involves active engagement with policymakers. From the beginning, clinicians, people on the ground, health service planners, and it really does involve picking the priorities, setting the research questions, actively engaged in the implementation of research projects, and ultimately the dissemination into broader policy and practice. And in many ways, I think that's where we would like to see a lot of the partnerships, and we would like these things to really result in longer-term partnerships with health services. So there are some obvious benefits for researchers there, listed there. Developing understanding of the health system and policy issues, clearer policy directions for the future. Gaining access to that laboratory I was talking about is really important. Gaining support of health organisations, including that recognition that researchers really, I think, is really valuable of organisations of the value of their work. And it also provides an avenue for more effective dissemination of the research that people do. Obviously for policymakers, it gives us that better alignment of research with health systems and local priorities. Provides access to researcher knowledge, and that's a really important thing. We can pick up the phone and ask a researcher that we know, how can I solve this problem? I haven't got time to commission a review. What's the evidence saying? And those are really relationships that are built up over many research projects. And it also supports staff capability that I was talking about previously. So to achieve effective health research partnerships, we need to really appreciate that we do bring different perspectives and different motivation. So, academics, obviously there are imperatives in academic settings. They, of course, want to make a difference and publish research that changes practice. But also, we have to, as policymakers and as clinicians, appreciate that they need publications, they need research funding. We look at health system managers, they're really concerned about things like a sustainable health system. We look at clinicians, they're really motivated by trying to get the best thing for their clients. So we all have different perspectives, and when we are pulling together a research partnership, we really just have to be upfront about what are some of the motivations that bring us to the table. And these are, of course, generalisations. People are different, but these are some general things that I've observed over time and that the literature says hold true. And we also have different strengths. So, for example, academics can bring things like a focus on academic rigour. We know that industry partners really can bring business acumen and help us commercialise things. Policymakers understand that broader policy context and can really link us into decision makers. Clinicians, importantly, can tell us, well, is this idea going to wash? Is it going to pass the pub test or the ward test? Is it going to be realistic to implement in a sort of clinical setting? So some basic tips for partnerships. Really, the first thing is to really communicate frequently and communicate early, as Christine said. And it's really to scope out that project and give yourself time to actually think through these things. Identify sort of clear research questions, and they really need to focus on clinically and policy relevant activities. They need to be aligned with system priorities, and they can be either local or state priorities. You need to be clear where on the translation continuum that Don is going to talk about. What are you hoping to achieve? Where on that continuum is your work? And have clearly defined outcomes. It's also about aligning those research goals, the capabilities of the team, and partners' interests overall. And we need to discuss and understand what really motivates individual partners and really be honest about the incentives and deal breakers. If publication is an issue, discuss it at the beginning, have a bit of a chat, have something in place to really deal with those issues. It's not something you should be dealing with at the end of the process. If there are other deal breakers, just have a general conversation. You don't want to sort of dampen the discussion and the enthusiasm, but you also have to be upfront about why you're at the table and what you hope to achieve through a partnership. So some useful resources, Don's going to talk through those. There are also other resources that are available, and this is some stuff that's been pulled together by the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. And once again, I suppose I'll put this up just to highlight that the same sort of things that we're saying as part of the Translational Research Grant Scheme are holding true in other contexts, like in Canada. And they say things like focusing on research questions is important. Think about the research approach, have a rigorous methodology, but also something that is feasible. And we also need to focus on outcomes and think about what happens after the research. So these are some things that internationally we're starting to see as well. It's not just TRIGs. So getting the best out of partnerships, in summary, have a clear purpose and communicate frequently. Establish those partnerships from the beginning and also develop a shared understanding of research objectives, research outcomes, rigorous yet realistic research design. Think about the timeframes that you've got before you and think about the practical challenges of doing things. Start early. Think about the partner contributions and expectations, and also think about the project governance as well. It's a really important thing. As the project goes into the future, you can't forget the governance, because really that will determine how the project is run ultimately over time with the health service partners. Think about how you interact, what you hope to achieve through that process. So, and the final thing is really try to work towards those relationships that do generate trust and mutual respect. And then you'll find that this one project will lead into another project, will lead into another project, and that's how that system capacity is ultimately built. In conclusion, effective healthcare delivery and research does require partnerships. The great news is that those effective partnerships can do things such as reduce time from evidence generation to implementation. They help us to focus on the right questions. We also enhance our understanding of the application of that research to policy and practice. Importantly, I see this as one of the great spin-offs of things like TRIGS. It enhances capability and capacity within health systems, and that goes both ways, for the research sector as well as the policy and implementation and practical sectors, the clinicians. And we, importantly, reduce that research waste. And really, those partnerships are most effective when you engage early and you start at the research planning phase, not later on, as I sort of talked about with my personal case study. So thank you very much.